What is MVC? Model View Controller. Here is the simple definition. MVC is a framework for building web applications using MVC architecture. MVC stands for Model View Controller. Now, what is MVC architecture and what is MVC lifecycle? Suppose we have a user which is hitting a MVC website, okay? When he will press some button and request some data, then first request will go to the controller, then controller will invoke the model and get the data. Now here model is like the data only because model is getting the data from the database. Now as a next step, the controller will return the data to the view, and that data rendered in HTML format by view will be sent back as a response to the user or client. That is the MVC lifecycle, alright. Here in MVC model represents the data, view displays the data, and the controller act as an interface between model and view components to process all the business logic. Business logic means the functionality of your application written in code here, okay? This is the simple answer of this question. What are the advantages of MVC over web forms? If you have ever worked on web forms, then this question is for you. But if not, then you can simply say in interviews that I never worked on web forms, okay? And that should be fine. Now, if you remember web forms, in web forms, one ASPX file will have one ASPX.cs file, which means UI is tightly coupled with the code behind logic. For example, here is 1-to-1 relationship is between the ASPX, which is the designer file, and the ASPX.cs, which is the code behind file, right? 1-to-1. So this is called tight coupling. Whereas if you see the diagram of MVC here, see, one controller can have multiple views and one view can have multiple controllers. In MVC, one controller can interact with multiple views and one view can interact with multiple controllers, and therefore it is a loosely coupled design. In software or web application, we should always design our project so that module pages controller should be loosely coupled. In other words, they must be independent. For example, if you change one controller, then it should not impact any other view or any other controller, right? That should be the ideal strategy. Now we are going to see all the advantages of the MVC, and most of them are because of this loosely coupled architecture only. First and top advantage is separation of concerns. The MVC framework provides a clean separation of the UI from the business logic and the data with the help of MVC architecture, because now controllers and views are independent of each other. Second advantage is multiple view support. Now, due to separation of concerns, the model is separated from the view. The user interface can display multiple views for the same data at the same time. So one controller can have multiple views. Third advantage is change accommodation. Now you know in web applications, UI changes more frequently than business rules, right? Now because the model does not depend on the views, modifying view will not affect the model. These were the benefits of loose coupling. Now some other advantages are testability. ASP.NET MVC provides better support for test-driven development as comparison to web forms. Unit testing is easy with MVC architecture. That is another advantage. Lightweight in MVC framework, the request and response are bit lighter than the web forms. Now the last advantage is MVC has full features of ASP.NET. Like MVC is built on the top of the web forms only, therefore almost all the features of web forms are present in ASP.NET MVC. This is the answer of this question. Not all, but if you can remember 3 to 4 differences out of this list, then that will be great. What are the different return types of action method in controller? Now here we have an action method in a controller. After getting some data, here we are returning the view, right? Similar to view, we can have other return type also, okay? And here is the list of the 10 return types of action methods. Maybe there are 1 or 2 more. Now it's not necessary to remember all of them, but the first 5 are very frequently used, so you can remember them only, okay? Now let's see them one by one. View result. It returns a view that renders HTML is to be sent in the client. It is the most important one and the most common one also. Second is partial view result. It returns a partial view that is rendered within another view. Sometimes one view has many reusable partial view, and this is this partial view result. Next is JSON result. It returns JSON data that can be consumed by client-side JavaScript code. This is mostly used as the return type from the web APIs, which send the result in the JSON format, not in the rendered HTML format. Okay. Then next is content result. It returns a single string of content that is directly returned to the response stream. This is useful for returning plain text such as XML or any other non-HTML content. Okay. Another one is file result. It returns a file to the content for download such as PDF, image or video. Then we have this more 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 like redirect to root result. It redirects the client to another action method based on a specified route. Basically, it redirects from one action method to another action method. Then redirect result, it again redirects the client to a specified URL. Okay. Then HTTP not found result, it returns a 404 not found status code to the client. HTTP status code result, it returns an HTTP status code to the client such as 401 for unauthorized or 500 for internal server errors. Last one is empty result. It returns an empty response to the client without any content. This is useful like for AJAX requests that do not require any response body. Okay. Alright, I think all the response type return types of a controller action method are clear to you now. Try to remember the first 5, that is like enough to know. What are filters and their types in MVC? Let's see first the definition of filters. Filters in ASP.NET MVC are used to inject logic that runs before or after an action method is executed. Okay. Now let's see the code example. For example, here is the code of authorize filter. Okay. If any request will try to access this action method create, before that first this authorization filter will be fired. This will run. Okay. And it will check that if the roles in the request is of admin, then only it will allow to execute create action method, and if the role in request is not admin, then it will not allow the request to reach this create action method and run this action method. That is like a basic idea of the filters. So this filter run before the execution of the action method. Now here are the types of action filters we have: authorization filter, action filter, result filter and exception filter. First one is authorization filter, which I already explained. The definition is authorization filters are used to enforce authentication and authorization rules. Okay. They run before the action method is executed and can be used to verify whether the user is authenticated and authorized to perform the requested action or not. Second one is the important one, and that is action filter. This is basically a custom filter for which you have to write the code. Okay. For example, you want whenever this action method index is called, then you want to write the log before the execution and after the execution of this action method. Okay. Some log you want to write. For that, you will create one separate class log action filter like this. Here inside this on action executing, you will write the code going to execute just before calling the action method. Okay. So before the action method, and inside this on action executed, you will write the code going to execute after the action method is executed. So one is before and one is after the action method. Now your logic is ready. Then you will just put this log action filter class name like this at the top of the action method, and your filter is ready. This class will act like a filter. Now whenever this program execution reach here at index method, like the request will come here, then this filter will fire log action filter. This will fire log action filter, which is a filter, and it will run the logic which is written there in the class. Okay, so the definition of the action filter is: action filters run before and after an action method is executed. They are like the custom filters. They can be used to modify the behavior of the action method, or perform like some pre-processing or post-processing task. I hope it's clear. Now, if this is clear, then other filters are very easy. Like the next filter is result filter. It is very similar to action filter. The difference is it will execute before or after the result of an action method. Like remember result, and here view is the result, you can see, right? See, before returning this view result, our result filter has to be fired. Same as action filter, we will create the class log result filter with the two methods on result executing, which run before the method, before the result, and on result executed, which will run after the final result execution. And then we will put it at the top of the action method like this. Now the definition is: result filter run before and after the result of the action method is executed. They can be used to modify the behavior of the result, okay, like performing some post-processing task. So action, you remember, that was about the action. This is about the result. Now if you remember, output cache is also a type of result filter that is provided by the .NET framework only, because it will run after the result is executed. Okay, I will explain this in another question. Then the last filter we have is exception filter. I think you already guessed it right. Exception filters are used to handle exceptions that occur during the execution of an action method. So they run only when an unhandled exception will occur inside your action method. Okay, same, you will create one log action filter and write the logic inside this on exception method, then put the class as attribute above the action method like this. Now if any error will occur inside this action method, then code inside this on exception method of log exception error will run. All right, I think finally you know what are filters. Basically the only thing you have to know it: they run before and after the action method, the result filter, and the exception filter. So this is the whole story about the filters. What is authentication and authorization in ASP.NET MVC? These are the basic concepts, so let's quickly revise them. See this diagram. Authentication is who are you, or basically checking your identity based on your username and password. Okay, and authorization, if you see, it is checking your rights to do a particular thing or to perform a particular operation. For example, are you a admin user or not, or a normal user? That is authorization. Now if you are a normal user, then you can do two things. If you are admin user, then you can do all the things. So the definition of authentication first is: authentication is the process of verifying the identity of a user by validating their credentials such as username and password. Okay, whereas authorization is the process of allowing an authenticated user to access the resources. Authentication is always precedes to authorization, means it always happens before authorization. In normal applications also, like first user will log in, that is authentication, and then user will navigate to the different parts of the website based on the role. Like if it is a normal user, then some rights, but if he is a admin user, then all the rights. That is authorization. What are the types of authentication in ASP.NET MVC? We have 4 types of authentication in ASP.NET MVC. This is a theoretical question. Okay, so first one is the form authentication. It is a cookie-based authentication mechanism that uses user credentials stored in database to authenticate the user. Okay, this is the most common one. And here is setting in config file where you can set the, like in the screenshot you can see, you can set the login form name like this. Okay, second one is passport authentication. passport authentication is a centralized mechanism provided by Microsoft. Okay, so basically instead of using your own forms, we can use Microsoft forms. Okay, like this. The benefit is they are third party mechanism, but they are very secure. Like the normal hacker can access your database but to hack the Microsoft database is not easy. But yes, then you have to trust on the Microsoft this passport authentication. The next type of authentication is token authentication. Token authentication mechanism that uses JSON web tokens to authenticate user. Now, it is commonly used in single page application or APIs where the user credentials are not stored on the web server. Okay, so for this I have given a detailed answer in web API section. Okay, the last one is Windows authentication. It is a mechanism that uses the user's Windows credentials to authenticate the user. It is typically used in intranet scenarios where you do not have access to the normal internet, and basically your Windows account credentials are going to be used for like authenticating you. Okay. All right. These are the few authentication techniques you can share to anyone. What is output caching in MVC? How to implement it? You might be aware about the caching concept first. Okay, let's revise it quickly. Okay, client will request the data from the server, and then server will request this data from the database, and then database will send back the data to the server, and then server will send the response to the client. Now some data will be requested multiple times from server and then from database. So now here, in order to improve the performance, server will store this frequently required data in the cache, and next time client will request this data, then instead of going to the database, server will retrieve the data from the cache only. Okay, and since cache are small and mostly are the part of the servers only, therefore they will respond very quickly, and hence they will improve the performance. Okay, this is the general concept of caching only. Now in output caching also, we put the output cache like attribute output cache like this with the duration. Here duration means the result of this action method will be remained in cache for this duration of time. Okay, that is the duration of cache for which the data will remain there. So now when the first time the request will come, before returning the result content will be stored inside the cache. Okay, before returning the result, and next request will serve from the cache only. If like for 3600 millisecond there is no request, then the cache will be cleared. It will be that data will be deleted. I hope it is clear to you now. At last, the definition of output caching is: output caching in MVC is a technique used to improve the performance of web applications by storing the output of an action method in memory or disk. That is called cache. Okay, so that it can serve directly the data without having to regenerate it every time from the action method is called. One more thing, output cache is one of the type of result filter only, because it saves the result in the cache before executing the result. Great, now you know caching and output cache using MVC. What is routing in MVC? It is a very important concept in MVC and web APIs. Okay, the simple answer is routing in MVC is the process of mapping a URL request to a specific controller action method in a web application. Okay, for example, see this controller. Now when the request will come, then by looking at the URL, .NET Framework will automatically identify that home in this URL is the controller name. Okay, it will automatically identify, and index is the @action method. Okay, this automatic mapping of URL is called routing. Now some more things about routing is: the routing system is responsible for directing incoming requests to the appropriate controller based on the URL, which we already know. Second point is, the routing system is typically configured using a routing table which maps URLs to the controller action method. Now this routing table is automatically maintained by .NET Framework, so you need not to write any code or you need not to bother about it. So this is the basic of the routing in MVC. Explain attribute-based routing in MVC. Now this is the important question. You already know routing, right? Now sometimes you want to modify the default routing mechanism which is provided by .NET Framework. Okay, you want to modify it. For example, in example here, the URL says the request will go to the home controller and about is the action method name, right? But here if in the code you will see, you can put a route attribute like this, which will say if the URL has about action method, then in the request it will go to about action method it will goes to. So here is how we are modifying the default behavior of the routing by using this route attribute. So this is the attribute based routing where so the definition is attribute-based routing is used to manipulate the default behavior of routing in ASP.NET, and here you can have seen that how we are modifying it, right? Now, great, now it's clear.